Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Big Bout Podcast. This is John Suntress. I am also releasing this episode on the Word Balloon feed because I'm still letting people know that as much as I cover pop culture, I am back covering boxing as well. It's a sport that I covered from 1989 till 2006, and I took a bit of a break, a little more than 10 years, and am back now because I think the sport is exciting again. Lots of interesting things are happening. Great guest for you today, Bill Dettloff, who is the editor-in-chief of Ringside Seat, a great new boxing magazine that does great coverage of both the modern sport and also classic bouts, and I'm a huge fan. Bill also wrote an incredible biography of Ezra Charles a few years ago, and he used to write for Ring Magazine and HBO's website, but has a great editorial point of view, and really excited to talk to him today about not only the current scene, but some old fights as well, recent past and way back as well. So it's great to talk to Bill Dettloff on today's Big Bout Podcast. Just a few notes regarding some news. Man, we're almost in a 24/7 boxing news cycle, which is pretty amazing. Something I'm really not used to. But let's rattle off some of the new obvious headlines from the last couple weeks. Canelo signing with DAZN. It shows where the new powers in boxing are. HBO going away from boxing after 45 years. The writing was on the wall. If you haven't seen it, I really recommend on ESPN Plus Dan Rafel's conversation with Bob Arum. And Bob really cut to the heart of the matter, which is HBO is in competition with Netflix. And the cost of sports and the amount of subscribers interested in getting live sporting events from HBO, those numbers have been dwindling for several years. So, again, it's something that we talk about with Bill, but I can't say I'm surprised. I'm disappointed. I mean, 43 years, good Lord. I mean, I remember in the early 70s when they were covering the fight with Joe Frazier and George Foreman, and, of course, in 75, the Thrilla in Manila. And as Bill points out, boxing on HBO, there was a real journalistic kind of attitude about the coverage of the sport that seems to have gone away. Again, I point to the coming conversation in this episode with Bill Dettloff as we get into that a bit more. Manny Pacquiao sounds with Al Heyman in Premier Boxing. He's going to fight Adrian Bronner, it looks like, in January. I'm not surprised. I'm shocked at the IRS debt that Manny Pacquiao currently has. And signing with a guy like Al Heyman will guarantee him big numbers and big fights. I think Adrian Bronner is a good opponent from a marquee standpoint. But also, I hope he gets himself out of the hole. I really think Manny Pacquiao has, in a lot of ways, become the Sugar Ray Robinson of the 21st century. You can make comparisons to Joe Louis with his IRS situation, but Manny's young enough to still kind of take care of things. And it reminds me of when Ray Robinson in the 50s came back to boxing reluctantly because he wasn't making money as an entertainer and had to fight for the IBC and suddenly wasn't in the power position he once was in his prime. So I hope it works out for Manny, and I hope it means we have a lot of great fights coming up. As far as this past weekend, wow, 4 cards in one day. Could not believe it. Between DAZN and ESPN Plus, all over the place. I just want to point out the 2 big fights. Andrade versus Kauton Dukwa, I thought was kind of interesting. Obviously, we didn't get Billy Joe Saunders, but you have to hand it to Kauton Dukwa for sticking in the fight. I mean, God, he was down 4 times in the first 4 rounds, still managed to get to 12 rounds. And Andrade, well, he's got a belt now. So he's got a bigger bargaining chip to entice other middleweights. We'll see what happens. And then, God, Murata versus Brandt. Wow. You know, I am still kind of dwelling on the boxing decisions that happened with Canelo and Triple G in both fights, but certainly the majority decision last time in a fight that clearly, at best, was a draw. If you want to be generous to Canelo, I really thought Triple G won, and I've covered that in previous conversations. Again, something that Bill and I talk about in this conversation. But I got to hand it to the Vegas judges for calling a fight properly, and that might sound surprising, but, you know, it really does kind of seem like house fighters are getting their way on a lot of decisions, and Murata certainly had everything going from him from a marquee standpoint. His large audience in Japan makes him a very attractive opponent for Triple G, Canelo, any other name middleweights, because you can immediately make bank with the Japanese market, in addition to pay-per-view buys or whatever on this side of the pond. But, God, Brandt really came to fight Eddie Mustafa Muhammad in his corner and out-hustled Murata. Never really got things going. More competitive than I think the judges had it. I think they were leaning too hard on Brandt. I think Murata won a few more rounds than the judges gave him credit. But still, Brandt wins, and now we got this, Minnesota middleweight that is out there for, the same guys now, the Triple Gs and the like. And it'll be very interesting. Styles make fights. And we didn't get much style from Murata. Too straight up, too straightforward. Kind of let those first early rounds slip away, which I think, resulted in Brandt winning the fight. But here we are, man. We got a new player in the middleweight division to worry about. And it's interesting because I'm sure Murata's marquee value in Japan will still figure in a couple big fights. I'm guessing he might go to Japan, back to Japan, and have an easy 1 or 2 fights before attempting to entice a Triple G. Maybe not. Maybe right now is still the time for a guy like Golovkin to go over there and fight Murata. It'll be very interesting to see what Murata's next moves are after this loss to Brandt. So there you go. That's a few thoughts on the current scene. And I promise you we'll come on a more regular basis moving forward. It was a really tough October for me in terms of getting a new episode out there. But very excited about the conversation today. Bill Dettloff. I still have great classic conversations that I had in my Sporting News radio days when I put together a couple documentaries for that network. And I've got the raw interviews. I'll be bringing those to you in the weeks ahead. Bud Schulberg, Max Baer Jr., some great conversations with Bert Sugar over the years, my dear friend. But also another great Chicago boxing expert and a guy that has really seen a lot from the 60s all the way to the modern era. And that's my buddy Chet Kopic, an excellent all-around sportscaster and sports host. But loves his boxing, always enjoyed working with him for years at The Loop in Chicago and Sporting News Radio nationally. So it's great to get Chet on the phone to have a new conversation about boxing, and that'll be coming as well in the days ahead. But right now, let's switch things up and talk to Ringside Seat's Bill Dettloff. Great to get his perspective on the current scene. Now, we recorded this before the big weekend of boxing, so unfortunately you're not going to hear any talk about Murata or Andrade or some of the other fights that have been happening. But I think we give you a good sense of the game in general today. Some of my frustrations, I look to Bill for insight because I feel like I'm just getting my feet wet, getting back into the game. I'm a fan, and I certainly think I know my boxing history, but I am a student of the current scene and am wide open to hear the people with good points of view, and they can guide me on their thoughts. But we talk about Wilder and Tyson Fury coming up, and a lot of other things as well. And again, certainly one of the big things, and it was really one of the highlights of the recent issue of Ringside Seat, that Canelo Triple G decision. And Nigel Collins wrote an excellent piece in there that we talk about, and Bill himself had a good editorial as well. Ringside Seat, an excellent digital magazine. You got to get it. It's fantastic. They've also collected some of their best stories in a big book volume that has already come out as well. So it's a great buy. It's $10 a month. Mike Cronenberg, the associate editor, does a beautiful job in terms of the design of the magazine. It's eye-catching, and beyond the visual eye-catching, the content is incredible. They got Wally Matthews writing for them, a lot of the old Ring Magazine people like Eric Ratliff and Nigel Collins, as I said. So it's wonderful to talk to Bill Dettloff about Ringside Seat. Here he is now on the Big Bout Podcast. Bill Dettloff, I'm going to get familiar with you, Bill, and call you Bill instead of William. But welcome to the Big Bout Podcast and Word Balloon. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and I've been enjoying your work, both your biography of Ezra Charles and also Ringside Seat. Congratulations.
Thanks very much, John. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's great to get an independent voice in boxing right now because I think with the few established columnists, they're getting harder to find. And in your 5th issue, you guys talk about the Canelo Alvarez Gennady Golovkin rematch. Mm-hmm. And, man, I'll tell you, both your intro essay and Nigel Collins' column about the fight could not agree more. Or at least here, let me get what my inference is. That the house announcers have never been more house announcers, and it seems like objectivity when calling fights is starting to slip, or if, again, naivete, I'm going to say starting to slip away, maybe it's been happening for years and I just wasn't paying attention?
Well, first of all, thanks for the compliments regarding my intro and Nigel's great feature about the Canelo Golovkin rematch. Yeah, like so many other things, and which I wrote about in my intro also, every company has to make billions of dollars and everything these days. It seems to me, just as an outsider who's never going to make billions of dollars, it seems that every effort is drawn to make everybody a billionaire at the very top of the food chains, right? And so toward that end, it's not enough for broadcasters these days just to call the action. They have to sell the action. They have to make it dramatic and make it more than it is. And most of all, it's terribly important to the suits who run boxing networks and who run most things, that the guy with the contract with that network is made to seem special and extraordinary. And that can change in terms of from one fight to the next. Nigel mentioned in his column, in his feature rather, that the first time HBO called the first fight, it seemed like they were very overly favorable to Golovkin. And in the rematch, they were overly favorable to Canelo in terms of their broadcast. So it can change from fight to fight depending on where they see, on which side of the bread their butter appears. Okay? So HBO, which at one time was a great, great journalistic symbol in boxing, it seemed at the time at least, really became the symbol for how awful and commercialized sports broadcasting is, at least in boxing. I should say boxing broadcasting, because frankly, I don't watch enough sports to say how it is in other sports, but certainly in boxing broadcasting, it was just terrible. Just terrible.
Well, and again, I think other sports have that support of a league, and there's a little more objectivity, even though it is standard for the teams to hire the announcers for the TV network. They are paid by the teams. So there's always a bit of homerism going on in sports. But again, what drove me nuts about the Triple G Canelo fight was I don't mean to pick on him, but I think Max Kellerman is suffering from Tim McCarver disease. It's a little different than Lou Gehrig's disease, where you just have been doing this so long that you pontificate and really, and also there was a prepared delivery, that whole thing of he's winning the story, can he win the fight? And I've seen Max defend what he was trying to say. I'm shrugging, and I got to say sorry, and it's something that Nigel said, and it's just very obvious. Call the fight in front of you.
Exactly.
I mean, it's fine to in the preamble and as we're leading up to the fight, he's won the story. Can he win the fight? That's fine. But once that bell rings for round one, okay, it's developing in front of you. Call the fight. And really, I like Nigel had it for Triple G. I even had it a little further. I had it 116, 112, I believe. And I thought it was I could see 3 or 4 rounds where I really had to struggle to declare a winner, so I can appreciate it being such a close fight. But it's these unsatisfying decisions, and I've also seen that it seems like the majority of journalists out there either had it for Triple G or had it as a draw.
Yeah.
And to make the case for Canelo, I think you really have to struggle. That final round where I think all 3 judges had it for Canelo, it's like, really? Come on, man. And again, I just feel like the broadcast, Roy Jones, great fighter, horrible analyst. I'm sorry. It goes whichever way the wind is blowing. And my God, I miss George Foreman. And it's so funny because I bet if you were to talk to Roy, much as if you were able to get George off camera and have a conversation with him, they know what they're talking about. They're great analysts. And it's like, okay, where's that guy on camera? And I asked George Foreman that, and I'm like, God, because we were talking about Eric Morales. Again, this is, over a decade ago. And I'm like, hey, man, this is great. How come you don't do this on camera? He's like, hey, I'm there to be the clown. He goes, they got Larry, they got Jim. That's my role. I don't know what Roy's answer would be. But, yeah, it was interesting. It was very interesting. But, yeah, man, it's just, again, it's that whole idea of just the simplicity of, okay, it's happening in front of you. Again, football, baseball, any sport, the game is happening in front of you, and most of these guys are able to, sportscasters, just, call the game.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the main thing is just call the fight. And even that's redundant, right? Because we can see the action. There's a reason that Don Dunphy did it alone all those years.
Yes.
In the 40s, right? Because it's not on radio. We can see what's happening. But okay, I guess we need a couple of guys. And Howard Cosell, too. Often, maybe he had partners occasionally. But he often did fights by himself, right, in the 70s. But we can see the action. So, yeah, okay, maybe we have an expert analyst in there who points out, from a strategic perspective, some of the finer points of what's going on to those who don't know it or have never fought. So that's cool. So just call the fight then and stop telling us how great one guy is, because that's what it came to essentially with every HBO fighter, every HBO A-side was, in my mind, those guys telling us how great this guy is. Oh, look how he did that. Look how he does this. And isn't that wonderful? And not even mention the other guy. And that's just not it. And interestingly, and why it was so obvious to so many of us that it was just completely contrived is when those guys called a fight where neither guy, typically on an undercard, right, where neither guy had a long-term contract with HBO, they just did call the fight, and they had fun and laughed and just called the fight, and how refreshing that was. But when there was their A side on the card, it was just let's praise this guy, and he's the greatest thing since Joe Louis, and it was obvious to a lot of people. And I know Max and Jim, known them for a long time, and I like them both very much, and they're both really hyper-articulate, smart guys. But I also worked for HBO for a while and wrote a column for them. And I remember every assignment came with a request to remember HBO sensitivities. And everybody who works for HBO or for any giant outlet like that knows what that means. You know what that means.
Well, let's spell it out. I mean, again, lean on the fighter that has the deal with HBO, so emphasize that, as you just said, or, was there anything beyond that in terms of, helping HBO out with its cause?
Well, not for me, but I'm sure at that level there is.
Okay.
We always picture we tend to picture these, these conference rooms and these meetings that take place.
Smoke-filled room. Yeah.
Exactly right, where everybody's saying, okay, we need this guy to do this. We need this guy to make X number of dollars. But how can you think otherwise? Yeah. It's got to be like that. There's no way it can't be.
Did you hear? Well, no, you didn't. You were telling me off the air that you don't normally listen to podcasts. Teddy Atlas was just on Joe Rogan's podcast. Mm-hmm. And Teddy, another guy who, unfortunately, when he's on ESPN, particularly when he's matched with Stephen Smith, the bombacity kind of clouds over the truth to power that Teddy sometimes says. And he really did spell things out. And I do know that it's a common practice, for example, the judges the night before a fight are probably having an amazing dinner on the promoter's dime. Yep. And it's this for a lack of better description, incestuous kind of relationship in boxing between governing body, promoter, management, and fighter that it's hard to find objectivity. And it's only hurting the sport. And I think we all know that as fans because and it's an interesting time right now as things transition from the typical pay-per-view model to the streaming models that are now happening and everything. Do you think it's going to get darker now? Because it seems that DAZN and ESPN Plus, I mean, they're going to be the places. Showtime is still in the game. Certainly Premier Boxing has their various deals with television and stuff. But it just seems like objectivity is getting harder and harder to find, not only in the actual official decisions, but again in the broadcasting. Do you think it's getting worse?
Actually, I think there's a possibility that all these different players will result in it getting a little better in terms of objectivity. I don't know. It's hard to say how it will shake out, but I know that this market where a lot of little guys come in and the big guys are no longer there to run things themselves, I think it will help. But I should say that the broadcasting piece aside, boxing has always been corrupt like this.
Yeah.
Always. Yeah. And we've talked about it a little bit before we came on air about the history of boxing and how it's always been corrupt. And you know what? Nobody got his shot at Joe Louis unless they signed a multi-fight deal with Joe Louis's promoter.
Mike James, right? Yeah.
Exactly right. It's everybody's which everybody blasted Don King for many years. This is the way it's always been done. And the mob entirely controlled boxing in the 1940s and 50s, without a doubt, hands down. And you read my book, and you know that. It's entirely controlled by the mafia. So just boxing has always been like this. And so, yeah, I don't expect a lot of objectivity. I never really have. It has gotten worse with the giant HBO doing so much business. But it might help that we have these new players in the game now. It might help a little, or it might not. As more things get commercialized, right? As more things get commercialized and everybody wants the big buck, maybe it won't. So here's the way you have to look at boxing, and the only way to enjoy boxing is forget all that crap. Forget the ratings, forget the title belts, forget the decisions. The only way to enjoy boxing is to look at the purity of what's happening between the fighters in the ring. That's the only way to enjoy boxing. And really, that's the only way to ever have enjoyed it.
Agreed, but again, another thing that drives me nuts, and I was telling Michael about this, and also Doug Fisher from Ring, and Golden Boy, obviously I should mention. Perhaps it would be better to stop doing 12-round fights, and I can appreciate. I mean, I remember well the glory days of 15-round fights. I respect the idea that they are thinking of safety, cutting it down to 12, but making it an even number is just a recipe for failure in terms of getting a conclusive decision. They should go to either 11 rounds or 13 rounds, and maybe they're afraid from a superstition standpoint of 13 rounds. And as much as I'd like to see, 10-round fights are obviously a great, bar in terms of can a fighter go a decent distance. Maybe 11 is right, because then if you have an unbalanced amount of rounds, it might, result in more conclusive decisions. Because I agree with what you're saying, but then still, when you hear them say, oh, it's a draw, or even a majority decision, it's like, hey, man, come on, give me a goddamn winner.
A couple of things. Firstly, I've never heard that suggestion before in all the years I've been involved in boxing media. So good for you. I'd never heard that. We should go to odd number rounds. That's interesting. Secondly, I don't even think that would get rid of the controversy around scoring, because it's just scoring a fight is so subjective. We're on the same page, right? You and I are talking right now. I'm sure in 5 minutes we could find 10 decisions that we disagree with on each other. With each other on, right?
Totally.
I'm sure we could. So it's so subjective. The other thing is boxing is married to tradition like no other sport.
Yes.
I can't imagine the outrage going to 11 or 13 rounds. And frankly, to be honest with you, I'd feel some too, because it's just we're so in love with tradition. And going outside what we're used to takes away our ability to compare and contrast fighters from different eras as much as we can, right? Interestingly, other sports don't have that same issue, I think. I just watched a couple innings of a baseball game recently, the Yankees playoff game. I was a huge Yankees fan when I was a kid in the 70s, okay? And I haven't watched 2 innings of baseball in probably 40 years. So when I was watching this and I saw that the Yankees, there was some play that was reviewed on slow motion by the umps, I couldn't believe it. I didn't know they were doing that in baseball these days.
Oh, funny.
I had no idea. So I was flabbergasted. But baseball fans, who also are married to tradition, right, as much as boxing fans, I think, have accepted this. So I think Larry Merchant told me this once, and he was right, that boxing has to evolve and change just like other sports have to compete with other sports, like the 3-point shots and 3-point line in basketball, and apparently the slow motion reviews in baseball. And really, boxing hasn't really done that. It's still in the Stone Age in terms of most of what the training is, right? The fighters still skip rope and hit the heavy bag and that kind of thing. And in terms of they don't use instant replay like that would be so easy like they do in every other sport. There's always controversy around whether a cut was caused by a butt or a punch, or whether something was a true knockdown. And boxing refuses to engage that in most states for reasons we can't understand. But so that's interesting. But there would be some resistance to going to odd number rounds, but it might help things.
Well, and I remember, again, it sounds like we're around the same age. I'm in my early 50s. I remember when they went back to, I remember when they went back from 15 rounds to 12 rounds.
Yep, me too.
And it bummed me out. And in fact, I noticed in your latest issue of Ringside Seat, I forget who did it, maybe Nigel, it was like the best welterweights of all time, with the exception of Ray Robinson. most of them were modern fighters in that list. And I almost wonder if, kind of like in baseball, the difference between the 154-game season and the 162 season, we've got a new demarcation line for eras. And it's like, you can't compare Carmen Basilio to, Floyd Mayweather, because Carmen was fighting 15-round fights the whole time and tough as nails. And, yeah, Floyd's great and everything, but could he do it for 3 more rounds? I don't know. And especially, well, now he's 40 whatever, but, 41 or whatever. Right. But, yeah, I wonder if, there is kind of a new separation of the eras because of 12-round fighters.
Absolutely. And there's a separation because of so many things beyond 12-round eras, too, right? But
sports medicine, nutrition.
Exactly right. In Carmen Basilio's days, I like to remind people of this. Fighters did their road work in dress shoes or work boots. Okay? Whenever I see a still of an old fighter, a fighter from olden days, old-timey fighters, right? They're running in dress shoes. I'm just blown away. How did Joe Louis fight for so many years running in dress shoes? How did he not have shin splints? I don't get it.
No kidding. And now, also, a lot of those photos, I feel like are, publicity photo ops. Because, Jack Dempsey chopping down a tree and wearing his dress shoes. It's like, okay, come on.
Exactly. But they didn't have modern running shoes. Right. A lot of these, I wrote a book with Joe Frazier, and which was in 2005, a training book and a boxing instructional book, and he insisted on including a passage that fighters should run in work boots.
Wow.
And when I was growing up, that's how fighters ran, in work boots. Yeah. Because they added weight or whatever. And wow, that destroys your knees. Destroys your knees. Right? And fighters today have $300 running shoes that it feels like running on a cloud. And there's so many things that changed. Even though boxing is in the Stone Age in many ways, in so many ways, so much of the training has changed.
Agreed.
And that's not always good. It's not always good. Fighters train 3 times a day now, a ridiculous amount of training, and to go 12 rounds, and guys who fought 15-round fights where they trained for 2 hours a day. One workout, 2 hours a day. But the difference was they were fighting much more frequently, right? They were fighting once or twice or 3 times a month. So when you're fighting that frequently, you don't have to train for 3 hours a day.
I hear you, man. No, I agree. I want to get into more of the contents of the latest issue of Ringside Seat. Great piece on Max Baer and Buddy Baer. And,
Great, thanks.
And I know you didn't write the piece, but I wonder, because I even asked Mike Cronenberg, your associate editor, about this. Mm-hmm. Had you ever heard regarding Max Jr., Jethro from the Beverly Hillbillies, that he was Buddy's son and not Max's son?
You know what? I didn't know that. It was only a few years ago that I discovered that he was related to a Bear, but I always assumed it was Max's son.
Well, I don't know if it's true or not. Again, this is something that Bert Sugar used to say to me, because I spoke to Max Jr. for when Cinderella Man came out.
Right.
And I wasn't able to interview Ron Howard, but on Sporting News Radio, our morning guy did. And I'm like, you've got to ask Ron why he chose to make Max Sr. such a bad guy, because every boxing person I know, from Angelo Dundee to some of the older historians and stuff, are like, Max was the sweetest guy in the world. He was not proud of the fact that he killed men. In fact, it haunted him. It was like, no, he was a human being. He's a decent guy. And it's like, Jim Braddock doesn't need a bad guy per se. Society and his life was enough of something to overcome. You don't need the opponent to be an asshole to make it a great movie. And of course, Ron said, "Well, we're doing a movie. We're not doing a documentary. Right. You do need a hero. You need a villain and stuff." Yep. And I get that. But I spoke to Max, and I was telling Bert, I'm like, I talked to Jethro, and he goes, I think that's Buddy's kid. I don't think that's Max's kid. And I'm like, I've never heard that before.
You know what? That never occurred to me. I didn't know that. But I will say this. They really have no resemblance to each other. Buddy.
Yeah, and if you see those photos in your magazine of Buddy, he kind of looks more like Max Jr.
Yeah.
So, I have a feeling maybe when Max Jr. finally passes away, it'll be, actually, he was Buddy's son, but he used the name. You can see from a Hollywood standpoint, it would,
Sure, it can't hurt. Right.
Yeah. And Max was great. I haven't released it yet on my podcast, but I will. It was a wonderful interview. And again, on radio, I only used highlights. So that's why I'm like sitting on like 6 or 7 really great interviews that I really did back in the early 2000s, and I'm like, this stuff is still good, and we're talking about history and stuff. So
absolutely,
absolutely. I'm telling my listeners as much as I'm telling you about that to look forward to a future episode. But
good.
But yeah, no, I think fascinating brothers and another great feature, and I think some of these champions like Max get overlooked. And it's like, no, if you really sit down and look at their careers, and man, I've even seen, I'm sure you have as well, Turner Classic Movies has a great, like, one reel short of Max sparring. And oh my God, he's an animal. He's a giant Mike Tyson. He's ferocious, incredible power, and it's just his pure sparring session. And he, and again, I'm sure he's playing for the cameras, but Christ, he looked amazing.
Yeah, he was a big puncher, and we really are so lucky to live in this age. Well, there are lots of issues with living in this age, right? But one of them isn't having access to all these great old videos on YouTube.
Yes.
You can put in any old fighter's name, and you're going to find, unless that name is Harry Greb, you're going to see a ton of videos on YouTube. And it's just great to look back at these old films. And sometimes they match what you're expecting and what writers have written about these old-time guys. Sometimes they don't. Max was a flawed puncher, okay, which happens to be my favorite kind of fighter, by the way. A guy who had very good killer instinct in the ring a lot of times and just looked to knock you out. One of my favorite videos, probably my very favorite video of him to watch is his fight with Max Schmeling, which Steve Cronenberg, Michael's brother, talked about a lot in his great feature, Bound by Blood, in the latest issue of Ringside Seat. And you should look that up. Anybody who's listening, go look up Max Baer and Max Schmeling in their wonderful fight in New York, and watch the backhand blows that Max Baer gives Max Schmeling toward the end, which were totally illegal.
Sure.
And for which he would have been penalized severely in today's environment. But he gets away with them then and just clobbers Max Schmeling to the canvas. It's a wonderful thing to watch.
Yeah, YouTube is a godsend for all these old fights. I remember in the 90s going to parties, and there would be like a boxing film collector, and it was like, hey, man, I got like 10 minutes of Charlie Burnley fighting. And we're like, oh, my God, Charlie Burnley, yes, please. Yeah. And stuff like that. And also, I know they ran on ESPN Classic, all of those fights of early television from the 40s and 50s that they have. Yeah. And those are amazing. And, oh, God, now I'm blanking on the kid from Michigan that was the college grad that welterweight that Kid Gavilan beat the hell out of.
I know you're talking about.
All right. Shame on us both. But, yeah, it was like, him fighting, whomever, just another contender. And it was like, oh, great, man. Now we finally get to see this guy. The college graduate that was a I'm thinking Art Aragon, or no, that's not him. No, it wasn't Art Aragon. And I haven't seen any Art Aragon fights. I'd love to see that. He's another great one from L.A. This was oh goddamn, and it's so funny because for like 5 seconds, because I made this Dempsey Tunney documentary, this woman Romy Kaufman, who was a development person at Paramount, actually asked me, and I mean, believe me, I was so down on the list, but she's like, oh, we're looking for historians for Cinderella Man. Maybe we should talk to you. And I'm like, okay. And I called Berkshire because he's like, yeah, good luck. They're talking to me. They're talking to Angelo Dundee. And I'm like, yeah, all right, thanks for bringing me back to reality. But I was trying to sell them on this fighter from Michigan. And again, I'm kicking myself because I'm like, it was like Quiz Show meets Rocky, because he was a college grad and, boxed in the Naval Academy and stuff, and was this welterweight that they built up. And then finally they matched him against Kid Gavilan. Kid Gavilan destroyed him. Because of the difference in skill and everything. But yeah, I love seeing those fights from the early TV days.
Is it Chuck Davey?
It was Chuck Davey. Nice going, man. Very good, Bill. Well done. I knew eventually one of us would suddenly realize who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the thing. I'm like, oh, that's a great story, the Chuck Davey story. Good Lord.
Absolutely. There have been a few of those over the years. You remember schoolboy Darren Van Horn?
Yes.
Remember him from the 80s, right? There's always every era's got their white college-educated boxer, right? That makes some noise on the way up and gets a big following and then gets crushed against a guy who didn't have
Holyfield fought a guy like that from St. John's. And it was like one of his either very earliest heavyweight fights or very last cruiserweight fights.
That was the Irish guy, right?
Yes.
Seamus McDonough?
Yes, nice.
Yeah.
Very good. Of course you know. Very good, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right about that. That's very, very funny and very, very true. It's interesting, I mean, again, that's why I'm fascinated by the history because, again, when boxing was on like 3 nights a week on television and radio and was such a fixture. And it's, again, I think, as we were saying before, the sport does need to evolve because, it's interesting. It'd be great to get, some of the audience back. And it seems like, God, I got to hand it to Top Rank. Yep. I think they're putting on very good fights on ESPN. Reasonably competitive fights. We'll talk about the Crawford fight in a second. But, God, I thought Lomachenko and Linares was a war.
Sure.
And I mean, good Lord, one of the best fights I've seen in decades, literally.
Yeah, about Lomachenko, he's just on another level. He's just an amazing guy. And I recently had a conversation with my old trainer from the days when I fooled around in boxing, and he's been out of boxing for a long time. But he watched Lomachenko, and his praise was, "I'd pay to watch that guy shadow box." And that's high praise,
you
right?
Bet. Yeah, from a boxing vet, absolutely, exactly, and a trainer and stuff. Exactly. What weight class were you?
Oh, I started as a 14-year-old kid. I was a junior lightweight, and by the time I ended at about 19, I was a middleweight. So I hadn't gotten my man strength yet when I started.
I got you.
But I pretty much had most of it by the time I was out. But anyway, yeah, Lomachenko is just on another level. Most of these guys are there's some very good fighters around these days. And if you want to talk about comparing contemporary fighters to old-timey ones, I always feel like the best fighters, the very best fighters of any era, can always compete in any era if they had to. Could always compete. Like Pernell Whitaker when he was the best fighter in boxing, or Julio Cesar Chavez. When they were like at the top of their game, I think they could compete with any lightweights and welterweights of any era, right?
Agreed.
So even if you think, and there's reason to suspect this, that the skill level is not the same as it was in the 70s or 60s or 50s across the board, right? That there's less skill and craft than there used to be in those eras.
Yep.
At the very top, those guys can compete with anybody. It's the guys, the contenders, and the guys just below the top 10 who are working at a much lower skill level.
Agreed. Well, and again, not to pick on HBO, but I remember when they were trying to promote Michael Grant, the giant heavyweight. Sure. And like many fighters, converted athlete from another sport, sometimes it works. And sometimes, I mean, Deontay Wilder is a current example of that. But I remember Bert Sugar, myself, and Bud Schulberg at the Garden for, I want to say, an Oscar De La Hoya tune-up before the Vargas fight. Or no, it wasn't the Vargas fight. It was some other fight. But anyway, Michael Grant's there, and everyone's like, "Hey, Michael, how you doing?" And he walks away. And as soon as he's out of range, I'm like, am I nuts, or is he a figment of HBO's imagination? And Sugar and Schulberg immediately, oh, yeah. Big guy.
Much.
But, he has to think about the punches, and I think that's I don't think we're getting the dedicated boxing athletes that really do learn the craft from boyhood like we did in previous eras. In today's era, I think again it's there's a separation between the truly exceptional and these guys, but unfortunately with the multitude of belts and lesser talent to challenge and everything, we're getting a lot of pretenders that get to be belt holders for a couple months or whatever, or years.
Yeah, the proliferation of titles is just so ridiculous. It's so out of control. That's one of the things that I tell people to ignore because it's just so ridiculous. If everybody's a champion, then nobody's a champion. It's so crazy, right? But here's the thing: we should always remember that this is generational. In the 1920s, guys like you and me were saying, "Oh, these guys couldn't hold a candle to the guys in the 1900s or early, in 1910."
Right. Sure. In the Jim Jeffries era. Yeah.
And in the 50s, they were talking crap about the guys in the 40s and 30s. So this is always the way it's been. It's just always the way it's been. And it's always going to be this way.
True.
But we also can assess fighters using the eye test, right? And a guy like, for example, Boom Boom Mancini who has some space in our current issue.
Yes.
Ringside Seat.
Yeah, the Dooku Kim fight. Great feature. Absolutely.
That's an excerpt from Mark Kriegel's wonderful book, The Good Son. When you of course remember when he was fighting, as I do, and
yes.
he's seen as kind of a manual laborer. Nothing especially skilled about him, right? A forward moving pressure fighter with a pretty good punch who ate a lot of punches, right? Yeah. And when I look back on his fights now on YouTube, I see him doing things from a craft perspective that even fighters today don't do.
I agree. Yeah, I hear what you're saying.
He was considered, again, it's a face-first puncher, but he had more skill than a lot of guys I see today. Again, not the top guys. No, not guys like Golovkin or Canelo or Lomachenko or the other top guys we're going to speak of and have spoken of. But compared to a lot of guys today, he's goddamn skilled.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt that way about Jerry Quarry watching YouTube fights.
Absolutely.
And yeah, it's like, oh man, if Jerry Quarry were just 10 years younger, he would have destroyed in the 80s. He absolutely would. And it would have been interesting to see him fight Larry Holmes. But again, in that multi-belt era that started as badly as it did in the 80s, it's like, yeah, Jerry Quarry probably would have been up there and stuff. And yeah, no, I hear you. And you're 100% right about Mancini. Yeah, God, and now that you say that, I think back to his Livingston Bramble fights that he lost, but my God, they were good fights. They were competitive fights. And, again, great combination puncher that I think people forget about. And yeah, like you say, always pressure. Yeah, great pressure fighter. Absolutely. My God.
So it seems to me, and this is probably I'm full of crap, but it seems to me that a lot more emphasis is placed on conditioning. And we talked about guys working out 3 times a day. They got special athletic trainers and nutritionists. Guys working out 3 times a day working on their fitness when they should be spending that time on the craft, right?
Yeah.
Just learn how to fight better. And you won't have to be able to go 30 rounds if you just, learn how to slip, learn how to pop and weave.
Let's start talking about, well, first of all, Crawford's last fight. Hey, show a nice showcase win. And I'm even forgetting, is it Benavidez? I forget what it
Right, Benavidez, right.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, good hand speed, and certainly early on, seemed to be countering with equal speed and connecting. It was telling when the sideline reporter was talking to Crawford's trainer, and he's like, "What about his power?" And he's like, "This kid has no power." And I'm sure that's how the fight was made and matched in terms of this guy's going to give you rounds, but don't worry, he's not going to hurt you and everything. And I'm sure that's why they said yes. But hey, great showy uppercut knockdown to lead to the stoppage with the second knockdown. I mean, no, a nice little highlight reel moment for Crawford. I kind of think Lomachenko's a better fighter, though. And again, they're 2 different weight classes. I think Lomachenko, by the way, and I want your opinion, I think he's found his ceiling at lightweight. I don't think he should move up in weight.
First, I'll say that we're so enamored of and invested in pound-for-pound stuff these days. And the reason for that is because all the divisions are so watered down. Seriously, that's exactly why we're so taken with these different pound-for-pound discussions. But anyway, I also think Lomachenko is a much better fighter than Crawford is. And I tend to agree also that he might have hit his ceiling at lightweight. His last fight was very difficult, and not just because the quality of his opponent was very high. Linares is a very good fighter.
Yeah. And
in fact, he performed better than I thought he would against Lomachenko.
Me too. Yes.
He's a guy who's enormously skilled, but seems to have some self-confidence issues. He fights in a manner that would suggest that he's not as good as he is. But he's got the tools to be a great, great fighter, but I don't think he entirely believes it for some reason. I don't know why that is. That's just the impression I get from him. But he gave Lomachenko a hell of a fight. But Lomachenko is on a different level, I think, than all these guys. The things he does in the ring are Willie Pep-esque, and he's a really good puncher. And so we never asked Willie Pep to fight Sugar Ray Robinson. Although, let me retract that. Willie Pep and Ray Robinson fought as featherweight amateurs in the Golden Gloves.
Wow, I did not remember that. That's fantastic.
That's in the late 30s, and Robinson won a decision. At any rate, we didn't ask the mature featherweight Willie Pep to fight Ray Robinson, who was a welterweight and middleweight as pros, right? So we really shouldn't expect Lomachenko to fight bigger guys who are welterweights. So I agree with your assessment that Lomachenko probably has hit the ceiling at lightweight, but man, he's going to be a hell of a lightweight, and he is the man to beat in boxing. I don't see anybody who does anything in boxing that Lomachenko does. Here's the thing, for me at least, a good corollary. My favorite fighter for a long time, after George Foreman had retired, was Julio Cesar Chavez. Sure. I watched him all the time, and I said, "My God, I've never seen anybody as good as this guy is." And I didn't care that Pernell Whitaker beat him and got robbed and got it.
I hear you. Yeah,
I didn't care. I didn't care because I like a guy who can knock a motherfucker out, okay? And Chavez could knock a guy out where Whitaker really couldn't at welterweight, right? He was a good puncher at light, but not really welterweight. So I preferred Chavez, even though Whitaker pretty much beat his ass, right? So a long time, I felt like Chavez is the best fighter I've ever seen in my era, right? Mm-hmm. And then I saw Roy Jones fight, and it was a revelation. I said, this guy has done things I've never seen anybody fight. Forget about just my era. He does things in the ring that I've never seen any fighter do ever. And for a long time, Roy Jones was the epitome of an extraordinary athlete who was a boxer, who could just get away with everything. I kind of feel that way about Lomachenko. The stuff he does in the ring is otherworldly. It just is. And he's a much better. Terrence Crawford's a good fighter, and there are lots of good fighters. Earl Spence is a good fighter, right? And Thurman's a good fighter, and although the welterweight division is stacked, right, as it always is, which was the point of Wally Matthews' excellent piece, the welterweight division is frequently among the 2 or 3 best divisions in boxing.
Agreed.
But Lomachenko is something else. He's just head and shoulders above everybody, as far as I can tell, in terms of what he does in the ring.
I want to talk to you about Roy Jones for a second because
sure.
I from an offensive standpoint, hand speed, unbelievable. When he had his legs, he was incredible. As soon as he lost his legs, his defense, his porous defense, obviously betrayed him. And at least my opinion. And also, it did bother me that we never got a Jones-Calzaghe fight. Yep. He's the first one that comes to mind. Right. Who else?
Until later. Right, we got that fight eventually.
Oh, excuse me. You see, shame on me. I forgot that we finally got it.
No, I think you might be thinking of Dariusz Mikuljuski.
Yes, and that was another one. Yes, indeed. Absolutely. Right. Well, and that's the thing, and it just seemed like Roy was too selective. In fact, when he beat John Ruiz, I was working at Sporting News Radio, and the laymen were all like, wow, this is quite an accomplishment. I'm like, it's an accomplishment, but don't capitalize that A, because this is Roy Jones beating the least talented heavyweight titleist out there.
Right.
And again, it's an accomplishment, but he's not ready to go full-fledged and fight Lennox Lewis. And also, let's not forget Mickey Walker obviously did a little damage in the heavyweight division as a middleweight and stuff. So there were those kind of fighters. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. Pardon me. But that was the thing about Roy, was he was a little too selective with his opponents. God, to wait 20 years to fight Bernard Hopkins after their first chess match was really ridiculous. And I got to admit, kind of in that way that Tommy Hearns got his due, even though he didn't get the decision against Leonard. I was kind of happy that Hopkins, was able to beat Roy in the rematch. Yeah,
that's a really good corollary. You're absolutely right. And the weird thing about Roy was that he fought guys who were non-entities, and HBO let him.
Yes,
paid him a lot of money. To fight non-entities. Never really forced him to fight anybody like Mikuljuski, and I know I'm mispronouncing his name. I'm certain of it.
I think Mikuljuski, as I remember, but that was a long time ago. But go on.
And other guys. And Roy's excuse was always that he didn't want to end up like Gerald McClellan, right?
Yeah, no, and I interviewed and watched many of Gerald McClellan's fights, right. So I understand.
Right, so we all get that, but ironically, he ends up fighting way past the time when his skills made him an excellent fighter, and got knocked out a shitload of times, and put himself in real danger of ending up like Gerald McClellan, because like you said, once his legs and speed pretty much abandoned him, then he got that big old lights out button on his face, and all anybody had to do was touch that button and he was out.
Yeah.
Glenn Johnson was never a big puncher. He just caught Roy in the right spot and Roy went to sleep.
And Magic Man too. I'm forgetting his name.
Exactly, Antonio Tarver, right?
Yeah, Antonio Tarver, of course. Yes.
Right, and when you're getting knocked out by Enzo Maccarinelli, wow, it's really time to go. But hey, I could never fault a fighter for fighting way longer than he should have. Not only for the money, because nobody ever has enough money, right? Everybody will admit that you never have enough money. Everybody says, "Oh, he made $1 million. How much does he need? More. Everybody needs more, right?" But also, in a broader way, in a more important way, to be the best in the world at something and just walk away from it. How could you? How could anybody?
Agreed. No, and you're right. And the majority of fighters make that choice and fight longer than they should. Yep. Ali, I mean, certainly Holyfield, Tyson, God, another embarrassing loss. Brian Nielsen, really? Exactly. Stuff like that. No, I agree, man. You're right. And totally. And in fact, I like a fool picked Tony over Roy Jones at super middleweight for their title fight. And the sports radio guys made me apologize to Roy on the air.
You know what? I remember going into that fight, and I couldn't decide who would win. And I remember this very clearly, thinking, you know what? Roy's great, but he hasn't done anything yet. Right. He's not battle hardened yet the way Tony was. I picked Tony too going into it. I'm sorry. Yeah, I picked Tony. Right.
Yeah.
So you weren't alone.
No, good stuff, man. All right, so coming up, man, I hate both of these guys. I mean, that's the thing. I have no problem saying, the fighters I like and dislike. Tyson Fury and Deontay Wilder. I'm so disappointed in Deontay Wilder. I get it. You're following the script. You got to be a tough guy at the press conferences. Man, don't you miss those days? If you see the newsreels, you don't see Joe Louis getting into Schmelling's face after losing as embarrassingly as he did in the first fight and everything. I mean, these guys had, whatever. But, now it's got to be a brawl at the press conference. They're both loose cannons. They have no skill. And please correct me, but Tyson Fury's win against Vladimir Klitschko was so infuriating because clearly Klitschko's head was not in the fight. He wasn't doing anything, and that's the only reason why Tyson Fury, on his tippy toes, on his little pity-pat punches, was able to outpoint him. And truly, ever since then, I'm sorry, I understand the guy does have some issues, and I certainly wish him no ill from that standpoint. But, man, that guy talks a lot of shit for a lot of very little talent other than, being a decent puncher. But yet I haven't seen him really be in there with a world-class opponent yet to see how well, he does when he's getting hit back. And, again, that's the only thing I think this fight is two power punchers with very little skill.
Yeah, a couple of things.
Yeah, I gave you a lot there. Oh, go on.
Yeah, that's okay. Tyson Fury is an interesting guy. And the way they're selling this fight, it should be kind of expected. I'll take a moment to say that Bobby Cassidy wrote about this. He wrote a preview of this fight that's in the current issue of Ringside Seat called The Sound and the Fury. And it's largely about how unlikely it is that the actual fight will live up to not the hype, but the entertainment value that's evident at the press conferences. Because both guys are big talkers and talk a lot of shit. And they have that in common, but they also have in common that they're not especially skilled. Now, first, let me talk about Wilder a little bit, if I may. Yeah. When he first started fighting at a high level, I don't mind him, and I don't necessarily dislike guys for the personalities they assume on a level on the stage because they want to get paid. And in this environment today, I think, although I enjoy guys who are just gentlemen and don't hit each other at press conferences, there's room for everybody under the tent, I think. Right? It would be nice if they were all gentlemen and, like everybody was gracious and that kind of thing. But those days are gone. Muhammad Ali ruined that for everybody. Okay? That's just the truth. Ali introduced that kind of shit to sports, not just boxing. And nobody did that before him, like the way he did it. Okay? Muhammad Ali did that. So everybody's replicating that because they want to get paid. I kind of get that. But there are guys who are low-key too. So we should enjoy them when they're during their press conferences and everybody's cool. I think Deontay Wilder has improved since the performances that made me hate him. He got himself under control a little bit. He was the most unskilled heavyweight quote-unquote champion I had seen in a long time. The way he not just that he's wild, because I'm a George Foreman guy, and original George Foreman was wilder than anybody, right?
Sure.
And I loved him, but Wilder's wildness, if you will, was worse than you can't even describe him as an amateur, because there are a lot of amateurs who are better boxers than Deontay Wilder. A lot.
Absolutely. Yes.
Right? Not even like world-class amateurs who know how to box better than Deontay Wilder. But that said, he's gotten better his last few fights, and I think that's largely the result of having been co-trained by Mark Breland, who was probably the best amateur boxer ever. And that's going all the way back to Laszlo Papp and those guys who were just incredible athletes.
I hear you.
And Teofilo Stevenson. Mark Breland was just an amazing amateur.
Agreed.
And he had the same, even though he was a welterweight, has the same body type as Wilder. Wilder's just a blown-up version, a heavyweight version. And he's gotten Wilder very good at setting guys up with the jab and then dropping in that great right hand. And then give Wilder this. The guy can punch.
Oh, absolutely.
His technique sucks a lot of the time, but he can punch, and his technique is getting better. And he's got the ability and the quickness and the speed to catch guys coming in with the right hand, not just at long range. So he's gotten better. So I can't brag on him as much as I'd like to and as much as I used to. For example, when he beat Chris Arreola and was just clubbing him on the head at the end of the fight like an MMA guy, it was just reprehensible, right?
Yes.
So his technique has gotten better, and I suspect it will continue to improve, because if nothing else, he'll fight anybody. He wants big money, and he's fighting everybody that they put in front of him. Now, there's some shit in front of him, mostly, right? But he's not turning fights down. He's fighting the best guys that he can, I think. Now, that brings us to Tyson Fury, who's also a bit of a whack job, and he's got emotional issues. But every friggin' fighter has emotional issues, or they wouldn't be fighters. He wears them on his sleeve, I think, more than most fighters do. And that's part of his charm. He's a mess. You made an interesting point about his fight with Klitschko, which absolutely was infuriating to watch, and possibly the dullest heavyweight title fight since Oliver McCall and Frank Bruno, which is saying quite a lot. Okay?
Yeah.
But I have my issues with Klitschko, but I think the reason that Klitschko would not throw any punches, because Fury's weird style, coupled with Klitschko's natural disinclination for getting hit, resulted in him keeping his hands to himself. It wasn't all Klitschko who wasn't there, I think, mentally. He's a guy who doesn't like to throw punches to begin with because he doesn't like opening himself up to getting hit back, right? But I think Fury's style, such as it is, made Klitschko, it kept him off balance more than he never felt like he was in a position to throw punches. So here's a guy who doesn't like to punch to begin with. He likes to, throw a jab and clinch because he's afraid of getting hit. Against a guy whose style is so herky-jerky and weird for a big guy, and he won't let you get set. And that reduces the chance even further that Klitschko could throw a good punch. You know what I'm saying?
I do. No, I like your assessment. Absolutely, man. No, I think.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I was just going to agree more, please.
So Fury's got a weird style. And I think for a giant white guy, he's fairly athletic. We don't really see that in the ring. But for a big fat white guy, he's kind of athletic. And he does enough things awkwardly and incorrectly in the ring, and enough things correctly to handcuff some guys. Now, the two guys he's fought in his comeback are just awful.
Oh, that's just for timing. I think we all know that. That's him just kind of getting the ring rust off. I mean, that, at least that was my assessment of those two guys.
I agree. And it was almost certainly best for him to go 10 rounds with the second of those guys, just to get feedback under him, right?
Yeah.
And also credit him for going after Wilder. A lot of guys in this position say, you know what, let's take our time. Let's have a few more fights. He says, screw it. Let me fight Wilder.
You see, now to me, that says two things. One, that he does, that he's really in it for the quick money grab.
Could be.
And that's why. His reluctance to fight after beating Klitschko, I thought spoke volumes. And again, we get the, and man, I sound like an asshole because there are people with genuine emotional problems. But yeah, you sound like you're a little suspect as well. I don't know, man. I just didn't buy it. I really felt like boy, this guy, and again, it's his crazy lifestyle. Maybe that had a lot to do with it. Maybe there's addiction or something that's involved in that. I have no idea. But it just, again, as a layman, I'm just not buying it. I think this guy just doesn't want to fight. Once he was happy to do all the endorsement deals that came with becoming the new heavyweight champion. I'm sure he made a lot of money in England doing, big advertisements and things. And yeah, like I said, I just think that this path towards Wilder is, okay, big money grab, great, see ya. And especially if he loses, I'm sure he's going to retire. Going to retire.
Interesting. I don't really see it that way. I think
I hope you're right.
Yeah. you hope I'm right that he's got really emotional issues.
No, more so that he if he does lose, wants to be here, because everything you've said is absolutely true, and it is his unorthodox style that I think makes him a challenging fight. For everyone that he has to fight and everything. So no, Go on.
Right. I do think he's got real emotional issues, right? I think, again, a lot of fighters do. And he just is more willing to wear them on his sleeve, as it were, than a lot of guys are, right? And they're maybe more severe than some guys are. But also, I think that he's also one of these guys who can get only inspired by the chase rather than the defense, right? A lot of these guys will tell you that too, that they're at their best when they're going for the title. And even in everyday life, we all need something to strive toward. And after he won the title, all this money and adulation and fame, that breaks a lot of guys.
Yeah, Buster Douglas,
Sure.
Example.
Look at Mike Tyson. All these
Mike
guys,
Tyson.
You're 22 years old. You never had two pennies that rub together your whole life, and suddenly you're making $25 million a fight. How does that not break you, right? So, and suddenly he's got all access to coke and all kinds of money and drugs that he never had access to before. He goes crazy. And you put that on top of existing emotional issues, I think it's a real good chance that he just broke apart right after winning the title. And plus he was, he's referred to as a gypsy, and there's lots of discrimination in Europe. It's not a good connotation, right?
Right.
So I think that his anguish is real. I think that if he would beat Wilder, I think there's a good chance he might retire, but not because it was just a quick money grab necessarily, but because he would see the same he would experience the same kind of emotional letdown that he did after beating Klitschko. Fortunately for him, he was not going to beat Wilder. So maybe it will inspire him and keep him focused and motivated to continue to fight and maybe beat somebody else. I don't know, but so that's a way of revealing my hand to say I don't believe he'll beat Wilder, and I don't think I'd like to beat Tyson Fury. I think there's a lot going on in that brain that is not good or fun, and I think the only reason he appears to be having fun now is because he can concentrate on this big goal that he wants to achieve, and when he doesn't, it's going to be time for a really nasty meltdown again, and that's just the way his mind works.
No, I appreciate that analysis, man. What about Luis Ortiz? I really hope that that's not the last we'll see of Luis Ortiz, because I thought that fight with Wilder. I'm a big fan of his. I mean, he's got fast hands, big dude, can clearly take a punch. Again, Wilder, hit him with a Mack truck right, but I also think the referee and timekeepers kind of helped Wilder out in between rounds after that big round that Ortiz had in his loss to Wilder.
Well, I think Ortiz will keep fighting because what else is he going to do, right? He's 68 years old, but what else is he going to do? It's an open secret that he's way older than his
39 or whatever that he claims to be.
Yeah, he's much older than that. He came over and got started way too late, like a lot of Cuban fighters do. But he's a very skilled guy. He may be the most skilled guy in the heavyweight division, right?
I'm glad you said that because that was my sense watching his fights. Go on.
Yeah, and I would have guessed anything that he was on his way to getting Wilder out of there in their fight. And by the way, that speaks volumes about Wilder.
Agreed.
That he survived Ortiz's rush there. The first half of the fight was awful, and I hated both of them for making me endure it because it was just a terrible heavyweight fight. But the second half heated up, and when Ortiz did his damnedest to get Wilder out of there and failed, you had to know that Wilder's right hand was going to put things right for him, and they did. And I don't blame him a bit for sitting down after taking a couple of those right hands. Again, Wilder can punch. And when he's got you, he might flail like a little girl to get you out of there, but he's going to get you out of there. But Ortiz is a very skilled guy, but I don't see him beating any top guys. But he's going to keep fighting because what else is he going to do? He's got to do something to make money. He can't just walk into some company somewhere and make $80,000 a year doing what he wants to do. It's like all fighters. When you dedicate your entire life to something, and then when you're not an athlete anymore, what are you supposed to do? You have no skills other than that.
Who's his promoter? Because obviously the problem is, I could see Joshua's people and other decent heavyweights going, I don't want any part of Luis Ortiz. Yeah. He's too talented.
Yeah, I could see that. They got to wait a few more years until he's
exactly when he's 50.
Until he's officially Medicare age eligible. But yeah, he'll beat some guys. But he's just, at his age and with his skill set, he's going to beat a couple of guys. But he's not going to beat anybody. I think at the top level, and certainly not Anthony Joshua, in my view.
I agree, and it suggests to me that you think Joshua's like the best right now at heavyweight.
It's interesting that you say that, because for a while I did. I loved Anthony Joshua because, as I said earlier, big flawed punches are my favorite type of fighter, right? And earlier in Joshua's career, the guy's a Mack truck. He's just huge. He's an extraordinary physical specimen. Mm-hmm. And earlier in his career, he walked straight to opponents and punched them until they were unconscious. And that was it. And nobody didn't take many punches either, right? Just an enormous physical specimen who just bludgeoned guys. And that's a great kind of fighter to be, right? If you knock out everybody, in terms of your long-term health too, if you knock out guys before they can hit you, you're going to have have your brains intact. But you're just not getting punished a lot, right?
Sure.
But I think his current trainer is trying to round him a bit in the way that Lennox Lewis was rounded, so that he can fight different styles and be a patient puncher. And I think that's going to be his undoing, unfortunately.
Interesting.
I think Joshua against Povetkin, for example, Joshua got nailed and staggered in one of the first couple rounds.
Yeah.
And hasn't looked good, I think, in several fights. And in my view, that's because he's even against Klitschko. Even that fight was much harder than it had to be, because his trainer has got him sitting back and jabbing guys, and trying to box and wearing guys out instead of just walking in there, throwing punches and getting guys out. And I granted that's not going to work for everybody, right? But everybody doesn't have this guy's skills, or his tools rather, not even his skills, his tools. Not everybody has his body or his temperament. The guy's a born puncher. He's a born puncher, and by born, you can encompass and include in that description maybe chemically enhanced, okay? Maybe not. I don't know. Either way, the guy is huge and a born puncher, and he gets guys out if he just walks straight forward and punches. And so I think his current trainer is trying to get him out of that mold. Lennox Lewis was a very good heavyweight champion because against the right guys he punched, and against the guys he couldn't knock out, he boxed.
Yes.
Right? He boxed Evander Holyfield. And Angel Galante just walked forward and punched him out of the ring, okay?
Yep.
And that served him well. I don't think Anthony Joshua has to do that. He can be the guy who knocks out everybody. But he's just got to fight like that. He should have never gotten staggered by a guy like Povetkin. Povetkin and Joshua should have looked like Foreman Frazier.
Funny. Yes.
There was never a point in George Foreman's career when somebody said, at least his first career, when somebody said, you need to box more. Why?
I hear you. Yeah.
You're
right.
Everything you need to walk in there and blast these guys out of the ring. And that's what I think Anthony Joshua should be doing. But his trainer isn't having him do that. And so I think there was a time when I thought that if he and Wilder fought, he blows Wilder out of the ring. There's not even a contest there. But if he stands back and boxes him and jabs Wilder, in my mind, that's a gimme fight. It's an even fight.
Interesting.
Because
interesting.
If he sits back, and the same thing with the Klitschko fight, he's sitting back and jabbing Klitschko, which is Klitschko's fight. Every time he stepped forward and just threw punches, Klitschko shit his pants and went down. Because that's Vladimir Klitschko. He's got this disinclination of getting hit, right? And because Joshua's a great puncher. But he got knocked down because he's sitting on the outside fencing with this guy who won 70 fights almost fencing people. That's what he does. You can't fence with a fencer. You got to go in and get inside and throw your punches. And so that's kind of the fighter he's becoming. So if he fights that way against Deontay Wilder, which I think he probably will at this point, it's a 50-50 fight. But if he fights the way young George Foreman used to fight, where he just has complete self-belief in his power and just goes in there and says, I'm going to hit you before you hit me, and I'm going to hit you harder than you hit me, so I'm just going to knock your ass out. He could beat everybody for 10 years. He's that kind of puncher. But I suspect that he's not getting the right training. But that's what do I know?
Hey, man. No, I like it. I like your point of view. This is the kind of thing people can find not only from yourself but your other contributors at Ringside Seat. And I do. I love this combination of and I know a lot of the publications do this as well. They look back at the history. But I really think you guys are onto something with your approach. You're 5 issues in. You also have a collection of the best stuff from your first 4 issues, right? That's out there.
Well, it's not. I wouldn't say it's our best stuff. It's very good stuff because all of our writers are great. But it's the stuff that would work best in a review. Okay. In an annual piece. Well, we've got such great writers, most of whom used to write for the Ring magazine. Okay, and not long after Golden Boy came in, we all got shit-canned, and we eventually arrived with Michael Cronenberg's, the great Michael Cronenberg's support to arrive at Ringside Seat magazine. So Nigel Collins and Don Stradley and Bobby Cassidy and Eric Raskin are all names that, and myself, are all names that you would recognize from the glory days at Ring magazine under Nigel Collins' editorship, which I think, in my view, and I know I'm biased, was the best Ring magazine there ever was.
I would agree.
In addition to those guys, we get guys like Wally Matthews, who's been a great New York sports writer for 30 or 40 years.
Yep.
And again, we got book reviews. We got Ed Groover, who's a very good sports writer. He's written 5 or 6 books on football and other sports. And again, a book excerpt from Mark Kriegel, who's another great writer who you guys see on ESPN all the time, was a great writer writing for the New York Daily News way before, 20, 30 years ago, before he was on ESPN, ESPN calling the fights. So we've got some really great writers who have a great appreciation for and knowledge of the history of boxing. And it's going to be this way every issue. That's
excellent. So the place to get it, ringsideseat.com?
RingsideSeatMag.com.
Got it.
The 5th issue, as you mentioned before. And plus, there's the 2018 annual that's out there they can get too. And, man, we're really proud of this. This is really good stuff. There's not in my view, and I read a lot of boxing, of course, there's no site or magazine that's comparable to what we're doing at Ringside Seat. It just isn't. And not only the writing, but Michael Cronenberg's graphics and design and layout are just gorgeous. You can just look at this thing. I don't care if you can't read English. You'll enjoy looking at this because it's just beautiful. The photos and the links to videos that we talked about earlier, the graphics are just gorgeous. Michael's an incredible designer, and the whole thing is just gorgeous from top to bottom.
I know his work from both the comic book world and also his wonderful work with Eddie Muller in film noir. Another great piece, Eddie Muller's dad. Really amazing. That's what I've been seeking out is, especially at Amazon, books by old fight columnists or sports columnists in general that had a concentration of boxing. And there's the W.C. Hines and people like that. Yeah. But I found a Minnesota guy that was actually even with the old NBA, what became the WBA. He's writing these very interesting essays about where boxing was going at the beginnings of the television era. So that's kind of, it is those kinds of older sports writers that I seek out and am interested in their views. And he was even talking about how they would get away with hometown decisions before television.
Oh, yeah.
Because the cameras weren't there.
Sure.
And so it was an outrage for about 2 weeks in the newspapers, and then we moved on to other sports and other stories.
Yep.
So they would die down. The anger would die down.
Right.
Didn't have the scrutiny that came with television.
Absolutely right. In the old boxing days, the managers would just pay off the boxing writers, and I mean all the boxing writers.
Sure.
To give their guy a good write up because who was there to dispute it? Nobody. The people in the arena at the time, which is a much smaller number of people than the people who were reading the newspaper account the next day.
Yep. It was very, very interesting. No, that's the kind of stuff I look for. So, again, no, you're right. Michael's, I think, graphics do elevate it, but really both hand in hand with your guys' coverage. I agree with you about that was Ring at its best. That's when I was reading Ring, was when Nigel and you guys were all doing your stuff. And, I'm glad you guys are still together, and I hope that this is a venture that will be able to continue and cover the sport as well as you guys always have. And I look forward to talking to some of your other contributors like Nigel and the
Sure.
like.
Absolutely.
In future episodes. And yeah, man, no, this is, like I said, hand in hand with the history of boxing. I want to hear from people that are covering it a lot deeper today and have a good handle on what's going on. And again, without that biased opinion that unfortunately we're starting to get from our media outlets and certainly the promoters and the management, they're always only going to support their guys. So, no, really, a real pleasure, Bill. I hope you'll come back in the future.
I would love
Thank you. Excellent, man. And, thanks for your points of view. And certainly in the months ahead, we got a lot of boxing to talk about.
We sure will. I'd be happy to be on again. Thanks very much, John, for having me.
A real pleasure to have the first of hopefully many conversations with Bill Dettloff in the near future. Again, go to ringsideseatmag.com. You can pick up their 2018 review book and also the first 5 issues of Ringside Seat that they've released so far. It's a fantastic magazine. The covers are eye-catching, beautiful art, and again, unbelievable contributors talking about the past and present of boxing. Mark Kriegel, Mike Cronenberg, Eddie Muller, Nigel Collins, Bill Dettloff, of course, the editor-in-chief that we just talked to, Eric Raskin. So many wonderful people. Robert Cassidy as well. All great writers, really know their stuff, and are really contributing incredible stuff. Ivan Goldman, who took over Boxing Illustrated after Bert left the magazine. So really cool people involved with Ringside Seat. I can't recommend it enough. And I will be talking more to their contributors and others in the weeks ahead here on the Big Bout Podcast. Thanks a lot for listening. I hope you'll let a friend know about the podcast. I hope you're enjoying it. Please, if you have any questions or comments about the show, this is part of the Word Balloon Network. You can reach me via email, john@wordballoon.com. Tell me what you like about the show. We're going to be leaning, as I say, into history as much as the current scene in our conversations here on the Big Bout Podcast. Thanks again for listening. Big Bout Podcast is a copyrighted feature of Shaky Productions, copyright 2018.